Forgiven, I am not alone. How I feel you around me.
There is nothing exceptional about the people in these stories. Each have traveled a different road, but because of Jesus Christ, they have all arrived at the same destination: forgiven.
Forgiven, I am not alone.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Forgiven. Today's episode, we're going to meet a man named John Curran, who is an incredible, gifted craftsman who found out in his own personal life that he couldn't fix himself. And during our interview, he gave a Bible verse, and I wanted to share that Bible verse with you. It's Psalm 40, and it says, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in Him. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord." And I know today that as you watch this interview, it would mean the world to me if you would consider making that same decision. So here we are in John's shop, and we can see how talented he truly is. Pictures here. What have you got here?
This is that original shop we had up at the farm. That we started in this, but this is the shop we worked out of that we called the Ponderosa Speed Shop.
The Ponderosa.
That's the Ponderosa there.
And is this you?
That's me. That's a 401 Buick engine with dual quads. It was in this 32 Ford.
How old were you?
Oh, I was just out of high school. I was probably maybe 18, something like that.
Wow. And that's you on the bike?
That's me on. That's an Indian chopper that a friend of mine had built. And that's just coming up the road by the farm where we live. This is a Model A coupe we had built with an Oldsmobile engine in it, and had a 3-speed, I think it had a 3-speed Plymouth transmission in it that we made a bell housing for. This was a T-bucket I built here. It's got another Buick engine in it. Wow. This here is a Corvair body stuck onto this chassis from the T-bucket that we was going to build a funny car, but we never finished it.
Oh my.
This is a convertible I had, a 55 Chevy convertible.
Been wanting to hear your story.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's exciting. You know, we did the book, but I didn't plan to do the book. So it's kind of, that just happened. But I wanted to tell you how I started doing what I do.
Yes.
You know, for 25 years now, I've spent as much time as I possibly could trying to tell people about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so I got to thinking, I don't think I've ever really told you how that happened. And what it was, about 25 years ago, I had a coworker come to me, and he said, "You look to me to be a Christian." And he said, "My wife is," you know, he went on to tell me all the horrible things that were happening in his marriage. He said, "I don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, amazingly, I've had a lot of the same similar circumstances with my first marriage that you're going through right now. Honestly, I can't tell you what to do, but I can sure tell you what not to do." Right. And so I did. I shared with him the mistakes that I had made, and then I said, "But I'll pray for you, you know," and we let it go at that. And on the way home that night, I was like trying to talk to God, and I was like, "Why in the world did you bring him to me, of all people?" Because I had been a Christian for a long time, 10, maybe 12 years. Right. But honestly, I was ashamed of being a Christian. Wow. I know, that's big, isn't it? And I was embarrassed to be a Christian. I didn't want to be associated with the Christians that I knew. And, you know, my addiction had been rampant. And then all of a sudden, you know, we'll get into that, but all of a sudden, boom, it was cut off. And so the people that I had drank with and partied with were, "What the heck happened to you? You're no fun anymore." That was a perfect opportunity to tell them about Jesus, but I didn't, and I couldn't. And So I went a long time underground. So all of a sudden to have this man come up to me and say, do that, I was like, well, why did he think I was a Christian? And apparently it was simply, I would pray before I ate in the break room, you know, and where I worked and whatnot. So later on, a few days later, I was reading in the Bible, and I came across to where Jesus, remember when Jesus cast the demons into the pigs?
Right.
Well, I came across that story, and it's twice in the Bible, 2 different places. And so in the book of Mark, it talks about the demon-possessed man came to him and, you know, threw himself down. But the demons inside of him spoke up and said, don't cast us where you're going to. Cast us in those pigs.
Right. And
so Jesus says, okay. And he casts them into the pigs. So the pigs immediately run down the hill and into the sea and drown.
Right.
And so the herdsmen for the pigs go into town. And then obviously they told the people in town what happened.
Right.
They come out and they're mad. I'm guessing it's probably the people that own the pigs.
Right, I would think so.
And they're mad. And so they get out there and to confront Jesus, but they see the demon. The guy was naked, living in the tombs, crazy out of his mind. They tried to chain him and they couldn't. They get out there and they find a cleaned up man, dressed in his right mind, sitting there with Jesus. So now they're not only mad, but they're scared.
Right.
And so they tell Jesus, you get out of here. We don't even want you around here. So Jesus says, okay. And he turns to leave. And the guy says exactly what I would have said. He says, I'm going with you. And Jesus turns to him and he says, no, you go back and you tell everybody what God has done for you. And that was like a big light bulb went off for me.
Time to start.
That's all I got to do. That's all he wants me to do.
Tell people what God has done for you.
Exactly. And it's not complicated. You know, I would say to God, I'm not a preacher, I'm not a teacher, you know. And he's like, I'm not looking for a preacher or a teacher. I'm just looking for you to go and tell them. So that's what I've done the last 25 years. Anybody I can find, I'll tell them what he did for me. And that's it. That's how our ministry grew.
So I'm really interested in hearing where you began, where it all began. Tell me about your beginnings.
As a child, and we've talked about this before, but as a child, I was sexually abused by some neighbor kids that were a lot older than me. And then I was sexually abused again by a man in town. He caught me at night behind a school and did things that were wrong. And, you know, in the 50s, you were not told, go tell somebody, or you were not told that it was okay to say no. It was the opposite. We were raised that if an adult told you something, you did it.
Right.
There was no questions asked. And so I did what the adult told me, but I knew it was wrong. And, you know, I went and told my parents. And when the kids got after me, I remember my parents, and bless their heart, they were just like, well, now don't be going and telling everybody about this.
Right, right.
And so you hold it in, and the shame and the guilt that you feel is never dealt with. And so then when the man got after me, it was like, well, if this adult is doing it, it must be me that's the problem, you know. And so the shame and the guilt just gets bigger and bigger. And again, you're told, you know, don't be telling people about this. And so shortly after that, you know, we in our neighborhood, everybody was playing baseball and having a great time. We all went down to try out for Little League. Well, I didn't make it to tryouts. Back then you had to try out. And so now I'm not only carrying shame and guilt, but I'm embarrassed because I can't, you know, I don't fit in anymore. And so that happened again the next year, and by then it was over. I was looking for another way out.
And you think everything just compounded, one thing on top of another, shame, guilt, sense of failure, all of those things.
And they just kept magnifying. And I talked to a fellow that I grew up with in that neighborhood here recently. He lives in North Carolina, and he said everybody in town wondered what happened, why you became the way you were, the outlaw, the rebel, the wild child that you were. And he said, I never realized. he said, everybody in town, nobody could figure out what happened to you. And but luckily, about that time, my dad, who was a horseman, he raised horses always. We moved out of town. He bought an old farm, and we moved out there, and it was like a pardon for me. I got out of town. I got away from all those kids. I got away from everything, and I was alone out in the woods and the fields and streams, and I loved it. And you know, we just raised horses, and I worked on the neighbor farm, and I loved it. It was freedom.
So what were those first things that you began to reach out to? Was it smoking? Well, how did you find what you found to be addicted to? How did that come to you? How did all that start?
Peer pressure. That's the thing, peer pressure. The kids that I had tried to fit in with as a young boy, we were now in high school, and everybody was playing football and whatnot, and these super athletes were looking for a way to go party. I had a car. You know, being out of town, I had learned to work on equipment, and I had become mechanical. I found that was my my strong point and not sports. And so I had a car, they didn't, and we started going out drinking and that sort of thing. That's where it started. But and honestly, you know, drug-wise, I've done everything except heroin, everything. And to this day, still, my drug of choice is alcohol. If I was alone, that's what I would go to. It wouldn't be, you know, I wouldn't be smoking pot or doing amphetamines or snorting speed or anything like I used to. It would be alcohol.
So you and your friends would get together and drink, but it was, I guess I want to say is, there's a normal stopping point for most people. And they say, I've had enough, or I'll just stop with one. What was it for you?
I didn't have that function to stop. My whole addiction, my addiction lasted about 18 years. And my whole addiction, and towards the end of it, I would drink until I would black out, not pass out, but black out. And you would be doing things, and you know, for example, you'd see somebody the next day, and they wouldn't talk to you. You have no idea what you did.
Wow.
To earn that, but you know you did something. But so I just would drink until I blacked out, and then I would come to someplace.
That's got to be horrible.
But the addiction, you know, it took me, because of my mechanical ability, and we had a shop at the farm, and people started hanging out up there, work on their cars, and you know, I got good at it, and the guys were coming out of the military, some of them Vietnam vets, coming home straight from Vietnam, and they had the money to buy a car, and good cars, fast cars, and we were building cars and working on them, and so I started hanging out. Before I ever graduated high school, I was hanging out with older men, and who were kind of on the crazy side, and I was trying to keep up with them, and but I found, you know, that's where I fit in, and they embraced me and welcomed me, and whereas the other society did not. You know, the athletes and the cool kids.
Right, right.
But so in my effort to keep up with these guys, it just, you know, I got more and more trouble.
How did Mom and Dad react to what was going on in your life?
My mother was extremely concerned because her side of the family had alcohol issues, and she knew I was headed down the same road and I was in trouble. My dad, bless his heart, was of the mindset that if you ignore it, it didn't happen. And so he basically just, you know.
He didn't talk about it, didn't?
No. So about that time, I got my draft notice. I had to go for my physical, which I did, and where we lived, it was all about a half a day bus ride to get to the place. And I passed it, but then you had to fill out a bunch of paperwork. The last question at the end of the whole thing was, if you're out on bail or facing any sort of legal action, you know, come talk to the person up front. Well, I'm out on bail. Wow. So I go up and the woman says, okay, well, they can't draft you till your court is done. And so you're free to go. So I was with another guy who was older, so we went out, got drunk, celebrated. And anyway, what happened was the district attorney found out what happened, which I think he knew it was going to anyway, but he found out, and he said, okay, he called my dad, and he said, here's the deal. The boy leaves town for 4 years. Either you do it or I do it, one way or the other. Mm. And I can remember that distinctly. And so our lawyer and my dad and I, we went down to see the district attorney, and he told me that. And the old man looked at me and he says, what branch is it going to be, boy?
So that was it?
That was it.
You knew you were being shipped off to the military.
Yeah. And so my dad, like we talked, was a World War II hero in my mind. And so he was in the Air Corps. So I said, well, Air Force. So that's how I ended up in the Air Force. Mm. Was it the ideal or the normal way to enlist? No, but I'm proud of my service, and I'm proud of what I did, and I'm thankful because I definitely matured and grew up.
Well, what did you do?
I was a mechanic.
Okay.
In the beginning, I went to a base just right near Nashville, Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. So being in the military didn't help you as far as your addiction was concerned?
Made it worse, made it way worse. Okay. Because in northern Vermont, I had managed to get introduced to marijuana, but that was it. And now, when I was in the Air Force, and at this time, I got introduced to speed, methamphetamine, you name it, peyote, everything. It was just a party time. And so, but anyway, that didn't last too long. They closed that base. Then I was shipped in New Mexico to a flying squadron, had F-4 fighters. So
your military career lasted 4 years.
Yep.
And then what happened after that?
When I went to New Mexico, I've obviously been a gearhead my whole life, and I found out about flat track motorcycle racing, and I loved it. So I started doing that, while I was in the Air Force, and I did that for several years, and that's how I ended up meeting my first wife. And she was working in a motorcycle shop there. I met her. And, anyway, about the time I was due to get out, I had a good friend in Vermont who was dying of cancer. And I wanted to see him before he died. And so the Air Force would move everything I had, because I was married. They would move everything back to Vermont, where I started. So we just had everything shipped to Vermont, which we didn't have much, and we went back up there. And that's how I got back to Vermont. But in Vermont, there wasn't the hard drugs still that there was in the rest of the country. And so I fell back into alcohol to solve the problems we had in our marriage. And that's never good. That doesn't work. So we got to a point where we said, I can remember my first wife said, well, everything was good when we were in New Mexico. Why don't you go back out there? And then we'll come out. Well, it didn't work.
So you tried moving back?
I moved, she didn't. And the kids were here. By then I had a son, and I had adopted her daughter. So, I loved those children. And so I came back, and I realized when I came back that it was over. It wasn't going to work. So that barreled me headlong into my alcoholism. That was the biggest setback I could imagine, was having my children taken away from me. Through no fault of your own. And
so you weren't allowed to even see them?
Well, I could see them, but it was a mess. It was tough. I would not get my kids until sometimes January, something for Christmas, and so I was the last on the list always.
Right.
When everything's done, well, go see Dad. Or it was an emergency thing. You take kids this weekend. But, like I said, that's what it was.
So what happened after that? What was the next defining moment? So you've tried going back to New Mexico and that didn't work, and then you came back to Vermont again, and then what?
We divorced. My first wife and I divorced, and it's funny, in the middle of that I adopted the girl, her daughter. And I remember we went to go for the adoption with the judge, and he's like, I'm not going to grant it. He said, you're getting ready to divorce the woman. All you're going to get is child support. You're not going to get anything else. Right. Why would you do that? And I said, because the only people the girl knows is here, and my family and me and here. And if anything happened to her mother, she'd be shipped off someplace she didn't know anybody. And I don't want that. So I'll pay the price to protect her from that.
It's pretty stand-up thing.
And that's what I did. And so anyway, we got divorced. But then immediately, or fairly quickly, she moved to Maine. So now I can't see them anyway because they're too far away. So that's when my alcoholism just went rampant. And then from Maine, she moved to Indiana. And I can remember my boy got hit on his bicycle and by a car. And, you know, I can't get near him. Nothing I could do.
Wow.
And I remember how helpless it was, the feeling. It was a helpless feeling. And so my alcohol, and I had gone to work. I was welding now as a full-time welder. I'd gone to school to become a welder finally. And I was working for a guy in a welding shop who was a full-blown alcoholic. So that didn't help. You know, you stay drunk all day long at work, and then you go ahead and get drunk at night. And I worked for a couple of welding shops, and they were all alcoholics. And it wasn't going good. You know, it was getting worse and worse. And about that time, I had met Bonnie.
How did you meet?
She was my kid's preschool teacher, and she was good to him, really good to him.
Some parent conference?
Well, what happened was I had surgery on my ear. I had a tumor in my ear, and it had encased my whole middle ear, and it was growing into my skull. And I was working bridge construction, welding on bridge construction, and my balance was going out. Not good. Yeah. High beams, lugging cable, no balance. It was not good. So they told me I was going to have surgery. I couldn't afford it, so we went to the VA, and the VA did it, and in Boston. But when I came back home after my surgery, I'd been gone a while, and I got a card from Bonnie. And it was, you know Bonnie, so you know her heart. And It was, well, if there's anything I can do, let me know. I'm here for you. And kind of give me a call, that kind of thing. And so I did. The rest is history.
Oh, not quite. Not quite. So how did it come together? I mean, there was a first date. There was there was it came together somehow. I want to hear this.
The first date, yeah, we it was funny. Actually, my brother-in-law and sister were at the house. We were having dinner, and something came up about Bonnie, and they called her Mrs. Hall. The kids called her Mrs. Hall. So my dad's thinking a woman 60 plus, and not some 20-year-old babe. And he anyway, something came up about you need to ask her out. My brother-in-law, my sister's sitting there. My brother-in-law says, if you're not going to ask her out, I'm going to.
So you had...
That's like, nice move.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I did. I asked her out, and yep, rest
if it
is
hadn't
history.
been for your brother, you wouldn't have
My brother-in-law, yeah.
Your brother-in-law.
Yeah, but anyway, yeah. It just, she reached out when I was sick, and it was a tough time because the surgery was large and, invasive, and I've never been the same in that respect because, obviously I have no hearing over there because they took the whole middle ear out. But anyhow.
So the next step was your addiction and now this new relationship. How did that work itself out?
It was difficult, and probably Bonnie can speak to that better than me, but for a short while I loved her parents. They were great great folks. And they accepted me right in. And she had been married to a guy who was an alcoholic before, and I'm thinking, why would they want me around, you know? But they saw something that I didn't. And they were really good to me. And so, you know, for a while, the drinking kind of toned down a little bit as we started to establish a relationship, but within a short time, it ramped right back up again. You know, you become comfortable with who you're with, and then you go right back to your old habits. And, you know, I was staying out half the night drinking, and bless her heart, I can remember her telling, we lived at the end of a long cornfield, and our house was there. She said she would stand in the picture window at night just watching the cars, traffic go by on the highway, waiting for a turn signal to come on.
Wow.
That I would be pulling in the driveway.
Wondering, when is my husband going to come home?
Yeah. And so I put her through that for about 4 years. And, you know, it just, it was not good. And I don't know why she stayed with me.
So at 4 years with it, what changed?
My mother had a tumor on her ear also. They finally found it and operated, but then she had a second one come. And it was in the brain where they could not operate. And so they basically told her, you have maybe a year, nobody knows, but it's inoperable and it will kill you. And my father was a fighter. He's an Irishman, a fighter, and he was not going to take that laying down. And so they tried everything humanly possible. But, you know, it wasn't to be, you know, it was my mother's time. And so my mother, outside of Bonnie, my mother was the only person who had totally stood by me, totally. And so I felt in my mind, the only thing, you know, the doctor says you might have a year. So I'm like, well, I'm going to get clean and sober. I'm going to show my mother she doesn't have to worry about me, even though she's, you know, facing death. Don't worry, I'm going to be okay. So I tried to get clean and sober. I failed. I tried again. And you'd go a few weeks or a month and you fail and you fall off the wagon miserable. And that probably happened a half a dozen times. You would go maybe a month clean and sober, and then disaster. You know, you would totally fall off it. And that's where I was at. We went up to the hospital one night to see Mom, and all of a sudden she started to have a seizure, and she had a violent seizure. In fact, it was so violent that the nurse that was there got right in bed with her and was trying to hold her because everything was just vibrating, and it was horrible. And it lasted what seemed like forever, and then finally it stopped. And the doctor said, you know, she's in a coma, and he said, I would doubt seriously she'll ever come out of the coma. He said, so, you know, I would say spend your time wisely. And so I went, you know, home, and I realized the one thing I could have done for my mother, I failed. I failed again. So what do you do when you're an alcoholic and you have that kind of situation? You go get drunk. And I can't tell you how long it was, whether it was a day, 2 days, 3 days, I don't know how long.
You went on a binge?
Yeah, I went on a beauty. And when I came to, I found myself in my basement. And you know, I'm gonna be real here, okay? I was covered in puke. I was a mess, you know, and I was in the basement, and I realized what a worthless human being I was. It was like, you know, you're just wasting air here. You know, you don't deserve to be alive. And so I picked up a .357 Magnum I had, and I loaded it up, and I cocked it, and I stuck it up to my temple. And there was nobody there with me, Byron. It wasn't a sympathy thing.
Right.
It was the real deal. And man, I was shaking like a leaf, you know. And I used to say, I don't know why it didn't go off, but I know now why it didn't go off, because God had his hand on it.
Right.
But I remember I could hear, and I swear to you all that's holy, I could hear my mother singing Jesus Loves Me. She was a beautiful piano player and singer. I can remember her singing, Jesus loves me. And but then I could feel on the other side, it's like, don't blow this dirtbag. You can do it. Don't blow it. Do it. And then I swear to you, I heard a voice, another voice that I'd never heard before. It was quiet. It was barely audible. And I heard distinctly, that's not the way. I'm the way. That was it. That's all I heard. Wow. And I was like totally confused. But I laid the weapon down on the workbench, and I remember the audacity of it. I said, well, if you're real, if you're who you say you are, you better be showing up, and you better be showing up quick. And within a week, I was laying on the floor crying like a baby, begging him to come in my life and lift me out of the pit of despair. You know, Psalm 40 says, he lifted me out of a pit of despair, out of the miry clay, and set my feet on solid rock, and put a new song in my mouth.
Amen.
And that's what he did with me. He put a new, and he didn't just turn my life around. He turned it around, and it was like I was shot out of a cannon, you know.
Right.
And I didn't understand it, but I knew I was totally different. I knew I now had a relationship with the maker of the universe, and
Yes.
I knew I had a relationship with God, and I didn't know what to do. I was alone. And I had no mentor or anything, and I was trying to find a church, and we couldn't find a church that worked, and all I found was condemnation, you know, and that kind of stuff. And we did join up with Bonnie's family church long enough to get baptized, but like I said, I went underground for about 10 years or more.
Well, I want to know what happened when you got home and spoke with your wife and told her that you had given your life to Jesus, or did you?
Not really. I mean, it's like people would come up to me and say, what's different about you? And I wouldn't say anything. And she knew that I had accepted Christ, and her family knew. And I was using her Bible, and I was in it all the time because I didn't have a mentor or anybody to guide me. I had to do it on my own. And so she immediately bought me a Bible and got me my own Bible. And I remember the first thing I looked up in the concordance, you know, there was no Google back then.
Right.
You didn't look it up online. And I looked up in peace. I desperately wanted peace in my life. I had had such a tumultuous life, and you know, because when you live a life of drugs and alcohol, there's a lot of criminal activity that goes along with it. It's just, that's the way it is. And so I had done a whole lot of things that I didn't understand how God could possibly forgive. You know, when you pay for an abortion, I figure that's no different than a mob hit, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
To me it was, and so I carried that kind of guilt and those things, but I looked up the word peace in that concordance, and I found Philippians 4, 6, and 7, and it talks about the peace that surpasses human comprehension. Man, I latched onto that big time. That scripture carried me for quite a few years, you know, because obviously the enemy was attacking me during all of this.
Right.
He didn't want me to succeed. He didn't want me to go right back. And so, man, I clung to that. And a lot of scriptures, but that one particularly. And so it just kind of, you know, we bought 10 acres on top of a mountain, built a log cabin up there. And it's in the book. And
Just you and your wife?
well, and her father, well, it was a family affair. It turned out it was supposed to be a hunting camp. But her dad and I went up, and it's a log cabin, and we cut all the logs and, you know, built the whole thing up on the mountain with just a chainsaw and a tractor and a hammer. And we stayed there 10 years. You know, I went to work. I was working at a paper mill by then, and I went to work every day. And when we got off work, I went straight home. I didn't go near any of my friends. And the only way I could survive was to go underground, at least for the first year, and stay away from everybody.
And temptation, was that always
Always
gnawing at you?
Sure. I'll be honest with you. If you're really truly an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic. And I've had pastors call me out on that and say, no, you're healed. God healed you. Yeah, he did heal me, and I'm in recovery. but I still have that gene in me. I still have that in me.
You still have cravings?
Not like I used to. It's subsided so that I can go to a bar and eat dinner, and I don't want to drink.
Right.
But I love the taste of beer. I'd give anything for a bottle of beer, but I'm not going down that road. I've done it, and I know where, and I know that as an alcoholic, yeah, God's healed me, or I'm in healing, but I'm in recovery. But I know I'm only one drink away from being where I was before.
Right. So you went underground for 1 year or 4 years?
It was about 10 years.
10 years.
About, basically. I mean, I was working, but any free time we went up on the mountain. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can remember going up there and in the winter time, and it would be 20, 30 below zero, and you couldn't drive up in there because of the snow, and we'd park down on the highway, and it was about a mile, and we'd walk in, and it would be beautiful, you know, it'd be pure stars everywhere, no lights, way out up on top of the mountain. It was gorgeous, beautiful, but cold.
Yeah. Yeah, too cold for me.
Yeah, it's too cold for anybody.
But so you did that for that period of time, and then what was the next change?
The next change was I was starting to hear God more. You know, I was spending more time with God, spending more time in the Word, and because I didn't have a church, I better be doing something.
Right.
And I felt like, you know, I had lived my whole time when I was in the military in the South. I wasn't real crazy about the snow and the cold, and I kept telling Bonnie, we need to move south. You know, you don't have to live like this.
Right, right.
And so she was had never really left that area at all, and she's like, no. And but she one day she went to get out of her car at work, and she slipped on the ice and slid under the car halfway and wrenched her back. And that night at supper, she said, well, we can talk about it.
So you came down to North Carolina.
Yep.
And what happened?
We were going to move. I thought we were supposed to go to Florida, and we had gone down there once for 3 months during the winter, and it worked good. And I thought, but I had a friend said, no, with your skill sets and the fact I was still helping people with race cars, and we were still involved in that late model stuff, and so he said, you need to go to North Carolina. And he said, that's where all the racing's going on. You probably get a good job there. And so that's how we came to come here.
So you chose the Charlotte area.
So yeah, just because of racing. Mostly we thought there would be work, but you know, I couldn't get into it in the beginning. So I just went to work. I knew the economy was good here, so whether I made it in racing or not, there was work.
Right.
So.
But how did that lucky
How'd that
break
happen?
or that opportunity present itself?
I was working at Ward Tank, and I went to work for Fat Man Fabrications building hot rod parts, and it was a good job. I liked it. I had met this man named Tommy Johnson, probably one of the finest men I've ever met in my life. And he was a racer. He was Harry Hyde's nephew. He was car chief on the old Bobby Isaac Dodge, and he took me under his wing. He was the mentor I had been searching for all my life. And I went to him. And I said, man, things are not going good at work. I said, why don't you and I go in business and build hot rod parts? And he said, no, he says, you're too good a friend to go into business with, which was pretty wise on his part. He said, why don't you just go to work for Rick, meaning Hendrick Motorsports? And so I've been trying to get in there and I can't. And he picks up the phone and he dials it up and he goes, Rick, he says, I got a guy here you need to hire. And he says, okay, I'll tell him. He gets off the phone, he says, go see Eddie Dickerson at the chassis shop. And so I did. And Eddie says, you know, we don't need anybody at the moment, but I'll call you if we do. Well, in racing, that I'll call you means, you know, get out of here. We're not interested. You know, they're not going to call you. And so I figured, well, I'll just keep calling him. So every week I would call him once a week and tell him I'm still alive. I'm still looking to get in. And then all of a sudden one day he called up. He says, we just had a guy quit. When can you be here? That was it. The rest is history, as they say.
But you must have been nervous, incredibly nervous, going into this profession what you longed to get into, and then now you've walked through the door, and how do you prove yourself?
Exactly. And I was older. You know, most of the people were young guys, and I was 45 when I moved here, and this was a few years removed, so I'm probably, 46, 47, 48. It was stressful proving yourself in a business that,
Right.
everybody's already established.
So you're building chassis for motorcycle race cars.
We were building, at that time, Rick had a 4-car operation, but, we were building Jeff Gordon's cars, and, Jimmy came on during that time, and building cars with Jimmy Johnson, and a bunch of other guys that were good. Yeah, you don't make mistakes. That's not part of the...
Right.
That's not an option. And so it was good. And it lasted about 4 years. I did in the chassis shop for Hendricks. And then a guy that was in R&D we were doing some lightweight control arms and spindles, special stuff we were coming up with. And he ended up going off on his own. And he was building parts for all the teams. And he gave me a call, and we got together, and I ended up starting my own little business, subcontracting work from him. So we were building lower control arms right here, and it was good, but there were issues, health insurance, that kind of stuff. It was just getting more and more difficult to survive.
Right.
And I can remember standing in my shop, and I was struggling financially. I didn't know how we were going to pay the bills. And I was like, God, I thought you said you were going to take care of me. I said, I'm desperate. I'm drowning here. And I came home that night, and Bonnie says, your old boss called from the chassis shop, and the boy that was building spindles on the 4824 team has had a motorcycle accident and smashed his leg up. They need somebody right now that knows how to do that. So
Door opened right up.
yeah, I got the job, went to work there. And we were working on the 48 car for those 5 championships in a row.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. It really was. And I can remember, I'm telling the whole book, but I can remember standing in a hotel in Las Vegas when we were there for a championship. And looking out over Las Vegas, all the lights. Had a hotel room that was, the bathroom was bigger than most motel rooms.
Right.
And had a remote control for the drapes. And I'm standing there running the drapes back and forth, looking out over all the lights in the city and everything. And I'm like, Dad, I wished you could see me now. Because he had told me when I was young, he said, boy, you better quit messing around with these old cars and find you something to do to earn a living.
It turns out those old cars turned into something.
So that was my beginning in performance automobiles, was in that shop up on that farm in northern Vermont. But look at where it ended up. That's what God can do. And but the cool part was not winning all those championships and being part of something gigantic like that. That was not the coolest part. The coolest part was what God was doing with me during that time. I had become comfortable sharing my faith with the men. I was constantly going outdoors to pray with people. Everybody knew that I was active in the Bible study at Hendricks, and my walk in regards to sharing my faith and working with people was growing by leaps and bounds. And that was the exciting part. And I met John Hendrick, Rick's brother, and he was a big factor in my life. He was another mentor that, John was very bold about his faith. I was not. And I watched him and I thought, look, God, I want to be more like John. How can I do that? And, I prayed that God would make me bold. And I learned a lot from John about sharing your faith and walking it out and being the real deal.
Right.
And so I attribute a lot of it to those two men, Tommy and John Hendrick.
At some point, you began visiting a rehab here in Charlotte.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Right after I prayed that prayer. Make me more bold like John. Well, it wasn't long after that, and we got a call and wanted us, me and another guy, to go down to the rehab down here in Charlotte, the rescue mission, and share our testimony. And I remember I told the guy, ain't no way I'm doing that. I'm a welder. I stick my head in the box and make sparks. I'm not, ain't no way. And he's like, he pulled a dirty trick. He said, so you're not going to go tell people what God did for you? And I was like, oh, here we go again. I said, that ain't right. So I pulled the Christian card. I said, I'll pray on it. And before I got in the house, I knew I had to go. But, you know, the first time it was ugly. First time I ever stood up in front of a group of men and shared my story was ugly. And but it was beautiful, because as I stammered and stuttered and I had it all written out, and I lost my place, of course, and then I started just trying to talk, and I can remember one of the counselors in the back came up with a glass of water, so I must have been spitting out cotton balls or something, because you know, it was ugly. But I remember this guy hollered out, he said, take your time, brother. We got all night. We're not going anywhere. You just take your time. You're doing fine. And then I would stumble along and somebody else would holler out and say, man, you're doing good. Hang in there. You're doing good. And they talked me through it. My first time of doing that, they talked me through it. I wouldn't have made it without them. And we ended up going down there every month for 14 years.
14 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was amazing. And the guy that started with me, you know, he was the catalyst, because he was a salesman. He was a good talker. He had a great testimony, and he was a rocker, so he could sing, and he was the whole package. And I just kind of tagged along. But then after a while, he said, I can't keep doing it. My work, I'm on the road all the time. So then I had to pick up the slack.
And you started kind of...
I didn't sing, I can tell you that. but yeah, we just, you know, but here again, God stepped in. And,
right.
and you know, I watched him do his deal and bring people on board who could fill in what we needed. And it was all him. It went good.
Well, that is the next stage, right? Right after that.
Then we started going to Brazil with you.
Going to Brazil.
And I think, you know, I'll be honest with you, ministry-wise, that was the best of times, was in Brazil. The best of times. You know, you and Pastor Wesley and Dr. Carlos, you pushed me out and made me, you know, who I am now.
But you were raring to go.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
But you guys, yeah, it was great. Those times were great. I miss that. But you know, but it made me, ministry-wise, who I became. It was because a lot of it was because of Brazil.
Well, visiting a rehab in Brazil, what was that like?
It was. I'll be honest with you. In the United States, here's the deal. If you go to church or rehab or anything in Brazil, this is my perception, and the Holy Spirit doesn't show up and do something miraculous, the people are all going, what's going on here? What's wrong? If you go to church or rehab in the United States and the Holy Spirit shows up and does something miraculous, everybody goes, what's going on? Wrong, but a different reason. They're scared. They don't understand it. In Brazil, they expect it. They expect the Holy Spirit to show up and do the miraculous. In the United States, we're scared to death if the Holy Spirit shows up and does something miraculous. Are we not?
Well, it seems that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so that was the thing that jacked me up about going to Brazil was, and especially the rehabs. You weren't with us this time, but you were there, but we had gone off with Craig Looper and Mike, and three of us, I guess, went to a rehab. And I remember we got started, and it was dry. It was going dry. It was dying, you know, what we were doing. And it was my turn to get up. And I got up there, and God said, you don't belong up there. He said, you belong down there. And so I got up and got the mic, and I said, I don't belong up here. I belong down there with y'all, because I'm not a pin's different than you. So I went down in the crowd and sat down in the crowd, and I don't think, I didn't put the mic up real close. I don't know if the other people that were standing around heard what I said to them. I talked to them. And it was one of the best times I ever spoke. Wow. Because the connection, it was like that first time at Rebound. You know, the connection between those men
was instant.
Oh, man, it was special. But I said, you got to understand, you know, I'm supposed to be the big cat up there talking to you. You and I ain't no different. I'm just further down the road, that's all.
Right.
You can be exactly where I am if you desire, if you follow God and let Him, you know, it's about that giving up thing.
Well, there was a neighbor of Dr. Carlos's,
Yeah.
just a house over. You want to tell that story?
A lot of times y'all would take Bonnie and I, because of my testimony and my history, and you would take us. I mean, we've gone and talked to prostitutes and everything, you name it, and anybody down and out, you would take us to share our testimony. And so one night you said, come on, we're going with Dr. Carlos. So on the way there, he was telling us what we were going to find. We had no idea. And he said, this woman, her husband's a crack addict, and she's been praying for him. And he said, I've told her we have somebody coming from the United States that can talk to your husband. I was like, whoa. That's a lot of pressure.
Yes, it is.
And so I remember we went in there, and I remember, you know, how neat the house was. We just showed up.
Right.
Thank God he wasn't high. That's all I can say. Thank God he wasn't high. But I remember how neat the house was, and we go in the kitchen, and we sit down, and Dr. Carlos says there was the guy sitting there, you were sitting there, I was sitting there, and his wife. And Bonnie and Dr. Carlos were standing behind us. And Dr. Carlos said, John is here from the United States to talk to you. So I shared my testimony. What am I going to do? I shared my testimony with him. Told him how God had lifted me out of the pit of despair. If he can lift me out of the pit, he could lift him out of the pit. And so I said, is that something you want? And he goes, yep. And I just had a feeling like I'm just being told whatever you want to hear, buddy. Right. I'm going to tell you what you want to hear. Just go away. And I looked at him, and God was beating me up. He was like, you got to dig deeper, man. And so I said to him, I said, you just telling me what I want to hear. And he kind of bowed up, you remember? And then he, no. And the wife kind of basically said, no, he really wants to get clean. And I'm thinking, yeah, you want him to get clean, but does he want to get? And so finally, I think I stood up and I said, you don't want that. You're not real. This is all a bunch of it. And of course, then the wife jumped up, remember? And it was on. I mean, it was on. They were going at each other in Portuguese. You couldn't even translate. It was going so fast. And I remember, I'm like, oh Lord, what have I started here? And so finally they stopped, and she says, no, he wants to get clean. And so I don't know where this came from, Byron. It comes straight from God. It wasn't me. I would never have done this. And if you want to get clean, you give me all your dope right now.
Yep.
And he looked at me. I said, I know you got some. Give it to me.
Yep.
Let's start clean. And so he went in the living room, and he got up over the top of a vanity thing, and he dug out a couple of crack pipes and a couple of rocks of crack cocaine and a lighter. And he come over and he give them to me. I give them to you, and you give them to Dr. Carlos, and he's shaking like a leaf.
Yeah, what are we supposed to do? We got drugs in our hands.
And so Dr. Carlos has a paper bag. He puts the drugs in. And so I looked at the guy, and God said, that's not all of it. And I said, now you go get the rest of your dope and give it to me, and don't you mess with me. And then he turned, he went in the bedroom, remember, and he got a jacket, and he started pulling crack cocaine out of there and pipes. And he brought it in, he gave it to me, I give it to you, you give it to Dr. Carlos. He's really shaking now. And so And I said, is that all of it? And he said, yeah. I said, here's the deal. You can score more dope before we get back to the complex we're staying at. But here's your starting point. You want a starting point to turn your life around? Here's a starting point. Make the most of it. Don't blow it. And so I said, we'll pray with you, and we're out of here. So we prayed with him, and we left. And I headed across that town with the two most nervous men in all of Brazil.
Didn't want to get stopped by the police.
I said, just, I was used to that stuff. I said, just drive normal. It'll be all right. Nobody's going to think you got dope in here.
Yeah.
And poor Dr. Carl.
Just smiling.
And that's just act normal. Right. That's all. No problem. And we get back to the compound, and man, he gets one of his people. He says, get rid of this stuff. But, that would have been big, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Would have been big. Doctor, pastor, local, missionary, and local, American, all busted for dealing drugs. And
that wouldn't be good.
That would have been big.
Yeah.
But I never knew what happened to him. But you know what? I don't need to.
Right.
And that's between him and God. I did what God called me to do. And if it worked, fantastic. If it didn't, it's between him and God.
Well, it's amazing, right?
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who's in a situation in their life where they're struggling, whether it be with alcohol and drugs, maybe it's with something that's happened when they were younger or something in their life that they're dealing with, that guilt and shame. What would you have to say for the people that are going to be listening to this?
It's about surrender. It's about it's not about you and you. It's about Christ. It's about God, and it's. I've worked with a whole bunch of addicts, and I could almost meet an addict, and I'm not going to. Don't take this wrong. I'm not being judgmental or nothing, but I could almost tell by talking to them when we met if they were going to make it or not. And a lot of times I would say to Bonnie, I'm worried about that man. Or there's a point where you give up control and you let God take control, and then you're on the road to recovery. Until you hit that point, you're not on the road to recovery. You're still in control, and as long as you're in control, you're in trouble. Simple. I never could beat alcohol until I was laying on the floor face down begging God to come in my life and turn it around. As long as I was doing it, I failed every time miserably. And I've watched that over and over and over with men, you could tell it was just, sometimes there was no sincerity or something, but when they were at the bottom and they were truly broken and they were crying out for God to take over, they always got clean. They always turned their life around. And it's about, God's grace and forgiveness is, you can't even define the magnitude of it. He can forgive and restore and rebuild anything. So don't think for a minute that you're too far gone or too bad. I used to think the things I've done, God can't forgive. It's a case of letting him. You got to give it up and ask him into your life to be your Lord and Savior. And when you really truly own that relationship, I mean, come on, man. You got a relationship with the maker of the world, and you think he can't cure your addiction? But it's about I found, and that's something that society teaches the opposite. Society says we're masters of our own destiny. That's a lie. That's a lie. We're not.
No.
And when you come to realize that, and you turn it over to him and let him take it, then you're on the road to recovery. He's got plenty of grace, plenty of forgiveness to go around for everybody. It just requires us to seek it and give up and seek it. It's just about giving up.
Amen.
But the world says no.
Right. Well, your latest chapter of adventures is has to do with the divine appointments, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's fun. I mean, it's fun. It's like, you know, we're on the camping thing. We worked. We came back from Brazil, and I went to work. I retired from Hendrick, became a chaplain. Went to work for a church as a care pastor, and went to work for another church as care pastor. So we covered about 6 or 7 years, 8 years, I guess, in that mode. And then I realized I was 68 and I'm working 24/7. I was like, I need to change. And so I retired from there. And somebody asked me one time, they said, well, what are you going to do when you retire? And I said, I'm going to go camping. And I never realized it was a God thing. So after we retired from the church, we went to Florida, and within a short time, somebody came to me and said, we have a sign we put out in front of our camper. It says, as for me and my camper, we will serve the Lord. So these people come up, are you some kind of minister or what? And I'm like, no, I'm a chaplain, but what do you got? And that was the beginning of it. I mean, it's just divine appointments. Every day when I get up, I pray, God, I know you have divine appointments for me today. Please give me the wisdom and discernment to fulfill them, and don't let me walk by them, because all ministry is seeing where God's working and joining in. It's not complicated. He's already doing the work.
That's right.
You know, you just join in. And so, you know, that time we were in Florida, we had quite a few of them, you know, come to us. And the old truck, you know, we tow the trailer with an old 56 Chevrolet pickup, and they'll come up to me and say, whether it's in a gas station or a campground, it's like, wow, that's a neat old truck. Did you buy it like that? Did you fix it up? And I always say, no, I restored it just like Jesus restored me from drugs and alcohol.
Awesome.
And so if they don't run away, we keep talking. If they do run away, that's okay. They heard it.
Right.
They heard the name of Jesus.
Amen.
That's all I was supposed to do. I've had it go both ways. I remember we pulled into Missouri one time to a campground, and it was on a big river, and they used it for tubing. And there was nobody there. It was a big campground. And it was kind of a rough area we went down into, and there was some locals had a bonfire going there, and I'm like, Anyway, this other camper pulled in beside me. So I went over to see if, you know, anything I could do to help him. He says, I see by your t-shirt you're a Christian. He says, I don't buy that stuff anymore. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, my son had cancer, and I prayed for 2 years for God to heal him, and he died. I wanted to tell him, if he's a Christian, is that not the ultimate healing? I mean, none of us get out of this deal alive. But I didn't. I said, well, have you talked to God about it? He's a big God. He can handle it, and he already knows how you feel. I'd suggest you try talking to him instead of me. And right about that time, his wife calls him in. She must have heard what's going on. And so, but I came to realize not all your divine appointments are pleasant or fun. Right. Some of them are difficult, and some of them are downright not good. And it's all right. I do what I do and let God pick up the shrapnel.
I remember you telling me one time about your truck breaking down.
Which time?
Well, you had told me that you guys were a little nervous about this situation.
Oh, the time in South Carolina.
You ended up being taken to a person's house.
Yeah, we had trouble with an alternator. So I stopped and I bought a new alternator and put it on. And I had only gotten around the corner, and it filled the cab full of smoke. I mean, the alternator shorted out. It was brand new. And so I pull over, I run around, pull the battery cable off, and I'm trying to figure what I'm going to do next. And it's beside an abandoned house, all covered in vines and everything. And this old boy pulls up in a white, beat-up dually pickup. He was obviously a biker. He had long beard and long hair. And he comes up and he says, you really shouldn't ought to stop here. He says, that's a crack house. He said, they ain't robbed you yet? I said, well, I didn't have much control over where I stopped, and I told him. And he said, well, my buddy owns that tire shop. He said, he gets robbed once a week. He said, we need to get you out of here. He said, I live out of town a ways. You think you can make it on your battery? I said, yeah. So he said, well, follow me. So we head out of town, and we drive, And we drive, and I follow him, and we're going further and further, and I'm thinking, oh Lord, did I jump from the kittle into the fire or what? And we get out there, and he makes a turn onto a dirt road. And I was like, oh, this ain't good. So I follow him, and we make another turn, and I look up, and it's Faith Road. And he pulls into his house.
Faith Road.
Faith Road. And he says, you know, he was a great guy. He just wanted to help. And so anyway, he took me back into town. I took the alternator back, got my money back, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I think I'm not too far from the campground we're going to stay at in Georgia. I think I'm going to try and make a run for it. And he's like, well, whatever. And he said, and Bonnie had gone in the house with his wife. And when we had gone into town, he told me his wife had had a stroke. And it was bad. They'd airlifted her out of there. And anyway, she was back home, but she was in rough shape. And so I walk in the house, and I walk in the house, and I look at the woman, and this just came out of my mouth. I don't know where it came. Well, I know where it came from. I said, I'm here to pray for you. And she said, I've been waiting for you. And so we prayed with her and talked to her and ministered to her and stuff. And then we got in it and headed for Georgia. But we never would have met that woman if that alternator hadn't died. And that happens. Sometimes you have divine appointments in ways you'd rather they were different. But
for sure.
I mean, I've had starters blow up that turned out to be divine appointments. And you know, it just...
Waitresses chase you down for prayer?
Yeah, that's a great way to communicate with people. You know, it's all about point of contact. We always ask a waitress when they bring the food, and say, we're going to pray over our food. Can we pray anything for you? And man, you get some reactions, but it's fun. I mean, I've had a girl in IHOP go, yes, sir, and grab Bonnie in my hands like this, and we'd go at it right in the middle of IHOP.
Wow.
Or I had a girl in Taos, New Mexico, and she went, no, like that. And then she came back to fill our drinks up, and she said, you know, you can pray for something. My brother's a drug addict. Would you pray for him? I said, you bet I will. I know all about it. And, you know, those kind of things where I've had waitresses follow me out in the parking lot and say, you know, I need to tell you more so you can pray what you really need to be praying. And it's all about point of contact, whether it's the truck or the sign or T-shirt you wear or talking to a waitress. It's just about spreading the love of Jesus. That's all it is. And I find prayer to be something that pretty near nobody will turn down.
Right.
There's a few that kind of, no, I don't need that. But for the most part, whether they're a Christian or not, or whether they believe in Christ or not, then they don't generally turn down prayer. And so if you can pray with somebody, I always put the plan of salvation in my prayer, you know, and then it's between them and God. You know, I don't do it in an overbearing way. I think that's why it works good with waitresses and waiters and things like that, because you're on their turf, you're in their territory, you're not coming at them, beating them over the head with the Bible. Right. You're calm and quiet, you're not confrontational. But when I pray with them, I always thank God for sending His Son to die for our sin and pay the price for our sin, and know that we now have open communication to you, Lord, because of what you did.
The first time I met John, he was actually talking to the director at the preschool in a conversation, and I was with a group of children, and I basically emotionally left my attentiveness of the children for a second and just kind of eavesdropped a little bit on their conversation. And he was saying that he was going to be going in the hospital to have some surgery, and that his parents would probably be bringing the children to the preschool. So, okay, so I just kind of, put that in the back of my mind. Proceeded, to spend time with his children and teaching them day in and day out, and asking them little questions about, how's your dad doing and whatever. So I thought, I wanted to reassure him that his children were doing okay during his recovery. So I did. I sent him a get well card, and I just probably was very simple. I'm thinking, praying for you. Your children are doing fine. I knew that was a big concern. So I had said something to a coworker. I said something about, I might want to date him. And so the daycare program was right next to a gas station. And I can remember him pulling up with the welding truck, and I was like, checking him out. And my coworker was like, there he is. And it was like, oh gosh, that's awkward. So, and I had been divorced for a couple of years. We actually both had been married the first time and divorced within the same month or two of each other. We'd both been divorced like 2 years when we met. So, I was single, and I had my own home and didn't have any children, and he had 2 children. And so I was going to become, a blended family. And so we got together, and I think I was probably more a stability for the children. Felt like, they probably needed me from many aspects, probably more than ever. And so I think I, fell in love with them too, So with John, with his addiction, it was the most difficult part was just knowing that there was, something way bigger in there. That was not him. That's how destructive addiction and the disease is that it's so crippling. It's, and I think my parents, the reason I think they just loved him was that, my mother had great discernment, strong Christian family, and, it was like a diamond in the rough. It's like, we just need to speak life into him, just keep speaking life. And so I think, the book, The Power of the Praying Wife, it's like this, that I could have scripted that too, just because that's all it was. I mean, that's the most I could do. That's all I could do. Right. There's really no way that you can say, stop this. And if you do, it just would backfire with you. You can't do that. I didn't understand it. I never drank. I never drugged. I was the girl that was at the parties picking up everybody's mess, literally. And so it was very foreign. I didn't know how to deal with him. So I just started praying, just believing that God was going to, bring it forth. And so I think my fortitude to stay in the marriage was basically just, God says, hold on, just be faithful. Just be faithful. You took your vows and take them seriously, What did you say to him? And I said, I was stay with him till death do us part. Sickness and health, and it was a sickness. It was just a destructive time. And so I wanted to walk that out. I didn't want to just abandon that. So I think the fact that he wanted different, he just wasn't ready to surrender. And so
when the surrender came, did you recognize it?
When he did, I think part of me was just a little more cautious. I was just like, because bless his heart, he tried and failed. That was true. And that's hard when you're just, you just want it so bad and you see the promise. And then it, kind of rears its ugly head back up again and starts all over again. So it's just that kind of just commitment, just staying committed and just saying, we're going to get through this. And, when we go and we speak to people and witness and I just can't imagine ever having given up on that past, In fact, it's just barely kind of a shadow now. We don't really, we talk about it because it's part of our story, but it's a very small part of it. There's so many bigger things that have happened since then that it just doesn't really have any really relevance. It does because of the recovery, but it just, it's just so much different now, so...
Was there anything you would say to any wife or, that's married to someone, not that wives themselves can't have the same addictions, but is there anything that you would speak, that you would say to? Well,
I think at the time I would have been like, In fact, I do a fair amount of that now, talking to women that are struggling. Sometimes it's, some other kind of addiction, a lot of pornography or, infidelity or something like that. So we do a lot of that because we both are chaplains and we have a heart for, bringing life to dead places. And so what I say to them is just keep praying. Sometimes God's timing is not on our agenda, and so we just have to be patient and just love on them unconditionally and try to reconnect with what your commitment really is about. And if you want that bad enough for yourself, then it'll, God will you'll step in. But it's like a surrenderance on the wife's part too, of just saying, I can't fix him. I can't do it. He's got to do the work, but he's got to ask the Lord to take it.
John has such an amazing story, and he's so full of love and wants to encourage people wherever he goes that Jesus is the only way to have victory in this life and in the next. Thank you for joining us today for Forgiven.
Forgiveness, oh, I won't let it go. Help my eyes see grace poured out from heaven's throne. Thank you, Jesus, you speak to me and call me clean. Thank you, Jesus, you bring me back to your heartbeat, and I can feel you around me, and heaven is not far from here at all. Your presence